Australian boom or bust. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Ainslie Insights, brought to you by Ainslie Bullion, Ainslie Crypto, and the Gold and Silver Standard as the Ainslie Group celebrates 50 years. Today, we welcome back Alex, who's been bringing it back home, looking into the latest inflation numbers here in Australia and why the Aussie dollar is underperforming against a backdrop where you might expect it to be doing a little bit better. How are you going today, Alex?
I am well, and you?
I'm going very well. Very interesting article today. It was actually put out just before we got the numbers. So I thought we might start off today with what actually happened with those CPI numbers that came out. What were they? Were they what you were expecting? Were there any surprises in the details?
So the number came out, everyone was expecting 3.6%. It came in at 3.4%, which was consistent with where it was last month. But to be honest, what I was expecting was probably about the same. You know, the Aussie dollar has been dropping, which creates its own inflation. So I didn't see a big drop coming in. So we've stayed about the same, which seems about right. No surprises, really. Inflation in housing, driven by our interest rates in the RBA. 6.7% inflation on alcohol and tobacco, no surprises, increased taxes on alcohol and tobacco. So going through, but probably a big surprise was the travel component, which did drop by 7.1%, which knowing people around at the moment are not traveling as much, it's being talked about a lot more, that COVID boom of travel's really gone. And people are doing it tough and they're not traveling. So people are doing the right thing and inflation is driving down those things like travel. Governments and RBA might not be doing the right thing and those inflation figures are going up.
And that hurts a little bit when you highlight those specifics in the detail there, because the point you just made, people doing the right thing, and you do see that anecdotally at least, less traffic on the roads during the weekends, less people taking the opportunity to have holidays in the middle of their normal weeks and reining in, tightening the belt. But then, as you pointed out in those numbers, it was the taxes that were really pushing those inflation numbers up. And that hurts a little bit when you go, well, I'm trying to do the right thing, but I'm also getting squeezed at the other end of it as well. It's a bit rough.
Taxes and mortgage rates driving up in, housing. And we've obviously spoken extensively about migration policies also assisting. So yeah, it seems to me consumers are doing the right thing. They are tightening their belt and they're being punished by poor policy.
So moving on from that, which is always frustrating, but in the article you mentioned something really interesting for me, at least, about the battery market. Now, on the surface, it's not obvious what batteries have to do with what's going on here. So can you give us a bit of an overview of how all of that fits in?
So a couple of weeks ago, the BHP half year came out. It was last week or the week before, and they had a huge write-off in their nickel investment. So about 2 or 3 years ago, nickel and lithium, super hyped commodities, driving into the EV market as well as the battery market. So if you remember when Adelaide was talking about going fully green, they needed batteries to do it. So all of that technology going in there needs nickel and lithium. And last year, lithium collapsed 85%, nickel collapsed 44%. And BHP got it spectacularly wrong. And they wrote off around 5.6 billion in both the nickel and the mining collapse that they had back in 2015. So they've had a huge write-off in their profits. And this has to do with, firstly, there's been an overinvestment in nickel. There's a huge supply coming through from Indonesia now. And really, the EV has not been what everyone thought it was going to be, especially in cars. A lot of companies are either talking about scaling it back or changing plans. Like Mercedes is now pushing out when they're going fully EV. You've got huge supply coming in from China, which, as we know, is crushing the German market. And you've got Elon Musk talking about it possibly crushing Tesla. So there's more supply, but we're not going to get there as quickly as everyone thought, which is slowing down the demand, I guess, for nickel and lithium.
And this isn't you saying, and I think this is a really important point to make to people, this isn't you saying that you think there's no future in electric vehicles or anything like that. You're just saying that maybe it got a bit ahead of itself and the hype was certainly there, But really, it hasn't delivered at that pace. It takes a long time. I mean, I drive a
And the,
Tesla. I
yeah,
know, it's still there's not that many charging stations around. I don't have the infrastructure in my where I live to plug in at home, so I've got to go to a charging station. I'm still probably doing a 15, 20-minute drive to get there. They're not everywhere. They're not prolific yet. So that's really what you're saying, isn't it?
that's absolutely. So the market is still the fastest growing market. There is no issue saying it's not. Charging stations, technology around cold weather, you don't have that issue in Australia, but in
Yep.
China over the Lunar New Year, the Chinese were just leaving cars on the side of the road because you have to charge them more regularly. And there were issues with ferries. So we all hear about the lithium battery um, fires that sometimes happen. So ferries in China are only allowed to have a mix of 10% lithium, EV cars on the ferry. So people couldn't book their cars to go back. So they just left them and had to get them towed later. So there's all sorts of technology is probably there, infrastructure definitely not there. And so the fastest, I think, growing class now is actually the hybrids. So a bit of petrol and
Yep.
EV because it gets you there when you need it. So, short city trips, probably easy on an EV, long lunar New Year trips, not so good.
Yeah, and that's such a good point because the hybrid model makes a lot of sense while we're in a hybrid economy, right? Like it takes time to fully adapt. That makes a lot of sense. Turning the topic again, you also mentioned in there, which is sort of bringing it back to this idea of BHP and our industrial, or sorry, not so much industrial, but our mining production that certainly happens in Australia. You talk about the iron ore market specifically and that having a big impact. Can you sort of give us a bit more color around that as well?
Well, I guess the nickel and lithium markets, everyone has gotten spectacularly wrong. And now people are starting to forecast iron ore futures. And there was a really interesting article by Yarra Capital that came out about a week ago following the BHP report. So BHP talks about quite a rosy or at least steady iron ore market, whereas Yarra Capital is talking about that there's a huge amount of supply about to come on from Africa. Brazil and Australia are still expanding. So there's more and more coming in. You've got China, which we've talked about the property bubble and how they've had a 15% overproduction of houses there to date. Now, as houses are approved, it might take 2, 3, 4 years for them to be built.
Hmm.
As cars are built, it might take 3 months total turnaround. So when you've seen these supply sort of side things and demand side markets going on in commodities, Yarra is basically saying, look, what's happened in the nickel and lithium market could be about to happen in the iron ore market in a perfect storm of excess supply, just like nickel and lithium, and dropping demand. They're estimating about a 10% drop in demand out of China with an additional probably 20%, 15% supply.
Yep.
So when you've got these supply and demand things going on, they're estimating that the iron ore could drop by about $50 per tonne, which when you put it to Rio Tinto and BHP, which dominate the ASX, could see a 10% dividend drop. I'm sorry, earnings drop on the ASX,
Right.
which is huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that really leads me to the point. It takes us full circle back to the start, I suppose, when we're talking about CPI. It's not really just about CPI here. We're talking about the Aussie dollar, particularly how we would normally expect it to move against the backdrop of what's happening globally and in terms of that CPI, and it not really acting that way. And I think that's the point you're trying to make is that, we've got the Aussie dollar probably should be a lot higher right now than where it
Well,
is.
the DXY is dropping. And so
Yes.
you've got the yen and the euro lifting against the US, and there's been no lift in the Aussie dollar.
No, and that's a really good point because we normally would expect to see that. So against that backdrop, if we can sort of turn the conversation slightly to looking at gold in particular, or gold and silver, but using gold sort of as a headline there, does that give us some performance benefits in this environment where we've got potentially a weaker than expected Aussie dollar and a weaker US dollar? How does that work?
Yeah, so with the Aussie dollar dropping, normally Aussie and gold go the same way together because they go against the DXY. But if the Aussie dollar is, at least staying par with where it is with the US dollar right now, and the US dollar keeps underperforming the yen and the euro, which is probably expected, gold prices will continue to go up according to that, and Aussie potentially goes down or stays on par. So it will overperform in the gold market compared to the euro and yen, which it hasn't done in a long time. Aussie gold gets buffered pretty easily because of the Aussie gold relationship, which is not holding at the moment.
So that's actually quite positive for people who are looking at that and seeing that potential unfolding from everything you've described today. Certainly something to keep looking at, because you could end up getting that double boost there. That's pretty exciting.
We'll see if BHP, who's been in the game for a very long time, gets their forecast right, or if Yarra Capital, which is a fairly new company, off the back of Goldman Sachs, so I know they know what they're doing, gets it right. Who knows?
Well, let's see if they can outperform those big misses earlier. Well, Alex, thank you so much for that. Wonderful as always. I really appreciate your work.
Thank you. It was nice to be here again.
Thanks everyone for watching. We'll chat again soon.